In 1935, Australia released 2,400 toads into a sugarcane field in Queensland to kill crop-destroying beetles. The beetles survived just fine. The toads didn't leave. By 1980, there were over 5 million of them. By 2011, an estimated 200 million spread across 1.5 million square kilometers of the continent. A single female lays up to 35,000 eggs a year. They were moving at 10 kilometers per year in the early decades. Then they evolved longer legs and started pushing 60 kilometers per year. Every attempt to stop them hit the same wall. A crocodile bites a toad, the crocodile dies. A snake swallows one, the snake dies. The northern quoll, one of Australia's native marsupials, saw a 75% population collapse in areas where cane toads arrived, poisoned because it tried to eat them. For decades, scientists kept running into the same brutal answer. This creature had no natural enemy that could survive it. But then, at the edge of an ordinary pond, something small, almost invisible, started changing that. And the reason it worked is exactly what no one expected. Here's the thing people get wrong about cane toads. They think the problem was just that there were a lot of them. But that's not what made this a crisis. What made this a crisis was the combination. And once you see all the pieces together, you understand why Australia couldn't find a clean way out for so long. Start with the basics. A single female can lay up to 35,000 eggs in one clutch. She can do that twice a year. And in Australia, there were no predators from their home range, no rattlesnakes, no caimans, nothing that evolved alongside them and knew how to handle them. So every generation hatched into a country that had no idea what it was dealing with. In their first few decades, the toads spread at around 10 to 15 kilometers per year, slow enough that the damage felt manageable. Local, something you could maybe contain. But the invasion front didn't stay slow. As toads pushed further inland, something unexpected happened. The ones at the leading edge started evolving longer legs, more ground covered per night, and the spread accelerated, eventually reaching 50 to 60 kilometers per year in some regions. Today, cane toads cover more than 1.3 million square kilometers of Australia. That's not a patch of sugarcane fields in Queensland anymore. That's a map problem. And here's where the toxin makes everything worse. In a normal ecosystem, a population boom gets checked by predators. Something eats the thing that's multiplying too fast. But cane toads short-circuit that feedback loop. Their skin glands secrete bufotoxin, a venom strong enough to kill freshwater crocodiles, goannas, monitor lizards, quolls. Animals that were supposed to be at the top of the food chain started dying when they did exactly what they were built to do. Hunt. That's the real trap. The toad doesn't just survive. It punishes the system for trying to stop it. So by the time Australia fully understood what it was dealing with, the toads weren't contained in one region anymore. The mistake had already compounded. Every year of delay meant more territory, more generations, more predators dead. And the question that kept coming back with no good answer was, if the thing eating your ecosystem also kills everything that could eat it back, where exactly do you hit it? So why not just go after them directly? Trap them, hunt them, find something big enough to eat them. That's the instinct. And honestly, it's a reasonable one. If you have an invasive species taking over, you target the adults. You reduce the numbers, you slow the spread. That's how pest control is supposed to work. But with cane toads, the adult is almost the worst target you could pick. Think about what you're actually dealing with. A fully grown cane toad can weigh over 1 kilogram. It's spread across terrain ranging from tropical wetlands to dry savanna. It moves at night. It doesn't stay in one place. And the moment any predator tries to grab it, the toad's parotid glands, those lumps sitting right behind its head, release bufotoxin directly into the attacker's mouth. The predator doesn't get a second chance to learn from the mistake. It just dies. That's what made this so different from a normal pest problem. Usually, when a species gets out of hand, nature has some kind of built-in correction. Something eats it. Something competes with it. Something slows it down. But with cane toads, the correction mechanism kept getting removed. Every goanna that lunged at a toad, every freshwater crocodile that snapped one up, every quoll that followed its instincts and treated a toad like any other frog-shaped thing in the grass. Gone. In some areas where cane toads first arrived, monitor lizard populations dropped by more than 90% within 2 years. Not because the lizards were weak, because they were doing exactly what they evolved to do, and the rules had changed without warning. And humans trying to intervene directly ran into the same wall. Manual removal programs exist. Volunteers collect toads by hand at night. Some communities run organized culling events. But when you're dealing with a population in the hundreds of millions, spread across more than 1 million square kilometers, removing toads one at a time is like bailing out a flooding room with a teaspoon. You're not solving the problem. You're just keeping busy while the water rises. So if you can't effectively hit the adult, and the adult's toxin keeps killing the natural predators that would do it for you, then where exactly do you apply pressure? If the fully grown toad is the wrong target, what's the right one? That question turns out to matter a lot, because the answer isn't about finding something stronger than a cane toad. It's about finding a moment in the toad's life when strength doesn't help it at all. To understand why cane toads were so hard to stop, you need to understand what a healthy ecosystem actually does. It self-corrects. When one species gets out of hand, something else steps in. A population spikes, a predator notices, numbers come back down. It's not neat, but it works. The whole system is essentially a web of checks, and every species in it plays a role in keeping something else in line. Cane toads didn't just slip through that web, they rewired it. Here's the mechanism. A cane toad looks, from the outside, like food. It's slow. It sits in the open. It doesn't run. For a goanna, a snake, or a quoll that evolved over millions of years hunting frogs and small amphibians, a cane toad sends exactly the right signals. Move in, grab it, eat it. That's what every instinct says to do. But the moment a predator bites down, bufatoxin floods into its system. The toxin hits the heart directly. It triggers a massive spike in cardiac output that vertebrate hearts can't handle. In large enough doses, it causes cardiac arrest within minutes. The predator doesn't survive to try again. And critically, it doesn't survive to teach the next generation what not to eat. The cane toad didn't win because it was the strongest thing in the ecosystem. It won because it made the ecosystem punish itself for trying to fight back. And that changes the problem entirely. You're not just trying to get rid of a pest. You're trying to break a feedback loop that keeps removing your allies faster than you can replace them. So the instinct at this point is obvious. Find something that eats toads. Problem solved. And honestly, it makes sense. That's how biological control is supposed to work. You have a species running out of hand, you find its natural predator, you introduce it, and nature does the rest. Clean, efficient. No chemicals, no traps, no armies of people out at night with rubber gloves. But Australia had already tried that logic once. In 1935, with cane toads, that's the thing people forget. The cane toad itself was the natural predator. It was brought in specifically to hunt beetles on the sugarcane plantations. It was the biological solution, and it became the biological disaster. So when scientists started looking at ways to fight the toad, there was an obvious constraint that couldn't be ignored. Whatever you use, it cannot become the next cane toad. Take fire ants as an example of what not to do. They're highly aggressive, they kill small animals, they're nearly impossible to remove once established, and they've already become a major invasive threat in parts of Australia on their own. Amplifying a predator like that to fight cane toads would be like putting out a kitchen fire by flooding the house. So the answer couldn't just be find something meaner. It had to be precise, targeted, limited to a specific window where the toad is actually vulnerable and where your tool is already operating anyway. That's the constraint that eventually changed the whole approach. Not what can kill a cane toad, but when and where and in what form the toad can actually be killed without costing you something else in return. So the whole approach had to shift. Not what can kill a cane toad, but when is a cane toad actually killable? Because here's the thing about a life cycle. An animal isn't equally strong at every stage. A fully grown cane toad is toxic, mobile, and spread across a continent, but it didn't start that way. It started as a tadpole, and before it could become the problem, it had to pass through a window, a very specific, very brief window where almost none of those advantages applied yet. That window is metamorphosis. The moment a tadpole finishes transforming and crawls out of the water as a juvenile toad, at that stage the animal is roughly the size of a thumbnail. Its skin is still adjusting, its muscles are weak. It has just reorganized its entire respiratory system, gills replaced by lungs, tail absorbed, limbs still finding their coordination. It cannot move fast. It cannot travel far. And critically, it cannot survive without staying close to moisture. Dry out, and it dies within hours. So while the adult toad roams freely across grassland, scrubland, woodland, and wetland, the juvenile is pinned, It has no choice but to cluster near the water's edge. Every single one of them. Every individual from every breeding event in that area passes through the same narrow strip of shoreline before it can go anywhere. That's not a coincidence. That's a bottleneck. And in any system where you can't fight the enemy across the whole board, a bottleneck is exactly what you need. The question that had been wrong this whole time was, what predator is strong enough to take on a cane toad? The right question was completely different. It was, what predator is already operating right now in the exact location where an entire generation of cane toads is temporarily stuck? And once researchers started asking that question, something that had been overlooked for decades started to look a lot more interesting. Now here's where it gets interesting. Meat ants, native Australian ants from the genus Myrmex, are already everywhere along these shorelines. They're daytime foragers. They patrol open ground near water. They're fast, they operate in large numbers, and they're aggressive toward anything small enough to be worth taking. They were never introduced. Nobody planted them there. They've been part of this landscape for millions of years. And against a juvenile cane toad, every single one of their traits lines up perfectly. The toad is small, barely a centimeter when it first crawls out. It's slow. Its legs are still adjusting to land movement after weeks of swimming. It can't jump far, and it can't sustain rapid movement. When ants swarm onto it and start biting, the toad's instinct is to freeze and let the skin do the work. The same strategy that stops a snake or a monitor lizard cold. But that strategy only works if the attacker absorbs enough toxin through the mouth to be affected. Ants don't swallow prey whole. They bite, pull, and work in pieces. The toxin never reaches them in a dose that matters. This is the key. Cane toad toxin is one of the most effective vertebrate deterrents in nature. It works on animals with hearts, nervous systems, and physiologies similar to our own. But ants operate on a completely different biological platform. Their nervous systems are structured differently. Their bodies don't process the compound the same way. The poison that drops a crocodile barely registers on an ant. So when the toad freezes, playing by the only rule it knows, the ants don't pause. They don't retreat. They keep pulling. In tests comparing cane toads to 7 native frog species at the same water's edge, the toads ranked last in escape performance across every measure: jump distance, running speed, sustained movement. The native frogs had evolved alongside these ants and developed the right responses. The cane toad had not. It brought a powerful weapon to a fight where that weapon simply didn't apply, and the ants were already waiting. So the question became, ants are already there. They already kill juvenile toads when they encounter them. The predator exists. The prey exists. The overlap happens naturally. So what if you could just increase the chances of that overlap at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right place? That's the logic. Researchers at the University of Sydney started testing in the field, not releasing new species, not building traps, not manually removing toads one by one, just placing small amounts of food bait near the water's edge, the exact stretch of shoreline where juvenile toads were emerging from the water after metamorphosis. The bait pulled ant activity toward that zone. Ant density at the bottleneck increased, and then the toads crawled out, as they always do, into a shoreline now packed with a predator that couldn't care less about their toxin. What happened next was not subtle. In the field trials, meat ants attacked 98% of juvenile cane toads within the first few minutes of emergence. Not eventually, within minutes. Of those attacks, more than half were immediately fatal on contact, the ants swarming, biting, pulling, overwhelming a body that weighed less than half a gram and had no speed left to escape with. For the ones that managed to break free, the outcome wasn't much better. Around 88% of those escapees died within 24 hours, not from a single lethal bite, but from the accumulated damage. Tissue injury, fluid loss, the physical cost of being held down and torn at, when the body was already at its most fragile. The intervention itself required almost nothing. No new species introduced, no infrastructure, no chemical treatment. A small amount of bait repositioned a predator that was already native, already active, and already killing toads, just not at the scale or concentration that makes a measurable dent. Australia didn't create a weapon. They aimed one that had been sitting there the whole time, pointed it at the one moment in the cane toad's life cycle where everything was stacked against it, and let the ants do what ants do. So what did all of this actually produce? When researchers manipulated ant densities at water edges using simple food bait, toad mortality at the metamorph stage increased more than 4-fold compared to sites where ants were left at their natural levels. That's not a small shift. That's restructuring the survival odds for an entire generation at the single most vulnerable moment in the toad's life cycle. Modeling studies went further. When meat and predation was combined with other early-stage interventions, specifically chemical signals that disrupt tadpole behavior, the projected reduction in adult toad abundance reached approximately 80%. 80%. That's a larger impact than any other applied control method that had been tested against cane toads up to that point. For comparison, removing toads manually by hand at scale produced equivalent results only when you eliminated roughly 15 to 25% of adults and juveniles directly. The ant strategy achieved that same pressure by targeting metamorphs at a fraction of the effort. The downstream effects matter too. When large predator populations decline after cane toad arrival, goannas, freshwater crocodiles, qualls, smaller species underneath them, in the food chain start to recover. Prey that was previously being controlled by those predators begins increasing in number. Some native snake species that scientists predicted would be devastated by toads have actually become more common in toad-invaded areas, partly because the removal of competing predators opened up new space. The ecosystem reshuffles in ways that aren't always catastrophic, and in some cases, native species that initially crashed have shown signs of longer-term recovery as populations slowly adapt to avoid toads. None of this is a clean victory. But for the first time, the math started moving in a different direction. Not toward more toads every generation, toward fewer. That's what targeted pressure at the right bottleneck can do. Not erase the problem, change its trajectory. So let's pull back and look at what this whole story is actually about. It's not really about ants, and it's not really about cane toads either. It's about what happens when you stop trying to fight a problem at its strongest point and start asking where it's most exposed. Australia spent decades throwing effort at adult cane toads, a target that was dispersed, toxic, and practically immune to conventional pressure. Nothing moved the needle. The problem kept growing, and the harder people pushed, the more obvious it became that the adult toad wasn't the right place to push. The cane toad's venom didn't fail because it stopped working. It failed because it was designed for a different fight. It evolved to stop animals that swallowed prey whole, animals with vertebrate nervous systems, animals that needed to taste one toad and survive. Ants don't play by those rules. They dismantle. They surround. They're immune to the warning. And at the water's edge, during that brief window after metamorphosis, the toad had no answer for that. Australia didn't create a weapon. They found a gap small, specific, time-limited, and redirected a force that had been sitting in the landscape for millions of years, pointing it at exactly the right moment. A species can carry poison in every cell of its body and still lose. All you have to do is find the place it has to walk through before it becomes dangerous. That's the lesson. Not bigger weapons, smaller gaps.